Hello, how's it going? So HPI have announced the Sprint 3 Pro, and I gotta say, I love it. I really want one. The first moment I saw it, I was confused. Really confused. I was like, what do you mean, Sprint 3 Pro? That makes no sense. So just to explain where I'm coming from, I have some notes here. And I want to just briefly talk about HPI's naming of this thing and why this confuses the crap out of me. So just in case you don't know, HPI used the moniker RS4 for their four-wheel drive on-road and sometimes even rally stuff. So they have Nitro RS4s, Super RS4s, RS4 Rally, anything that's four-wheel drive, independent suspension, tends to be an RS4. But within that, they have traditionally had three main categories. They've had the pros, the sports, and the sprints. And I just want to explain why this has confused the crap out of me. So I have my notes here. I have years they were either announced or released written down. These should be accurate. As far as my research has gone, these are accurate, but they might vary a year, either side, because the search engines I've used can't seem to make up their minds whether it was released or announced or whatever. The pros were, as they sound, high-end, professional level racing cars. They were the top spec racing cars, had all the adjustment that you had back in the day. It was the pinnacle of touring car technology, and they were made of exotic materials. And they had the price tags to match. They were all self-assembly kits. It started with the RS4 Pro. That was the first one in 1997. Following that, you had the Pro 2 in 1999, the Pro 3 in 2001, the Shaft Drive Pro 4 in 2004, that's the only shaft drive one, the rest are twin belt designs. And then there was a bit of a gap, 11 years, until the Pro 5 in 2015, although that was, I'm not really sure where that lies, because that was under the HB/HPI moniker, because Hot Bodies and HPI had a joint venture, but they're no longer associated with each other. So it was classed as the Hot Bodies or HB Pro 5, not the HPI Pro 5. So if they made a new one, would it be HPI Pro 5 or the HPI Pro 6? I don't know. But anyway, those were the pros. Below them, you had the sports. Now, the sports were fantastic because what the sports were also racing cars. They were, fully adjustable, and they were self-assembly kits. The difference is the sports came with clear body shells, the pros didn't at all. But the sports were great because they offered almost all of the performance of a pro without all of the price tag. They were much cheaper. So you had cars that were made of slightly less exotic materials than the pros. They might be a generation behind in terms of the cutting edge of design. Basically, the sports were awesome cars, great for sort of entry-level clubs or mid-tier club level, but not quite high-end, super exotic level. So you had the Sport in 97, same year as the original Pro, and then the Sport 2 in 2000, a year after the Pro 2. Now I'm going to leave the sports for a moment because we will come back to them. Below that, you have the entry-level cars, the Sprints. Now the Sprints are different because they are not self-assembly. They're either ready to run or they have a complete chassis and you put your own electronics on. And these weren't aimed at racing at all. They could be classed as street level, entry level, whatever. So the original Sprint came along in 2002, which was 2 years after the Sport 2. So the last of the Sport at this point came out 2 years before the Sprint. The Sprint wasn't a replacement to the Sport because the Sprint had fixed links. They didn't have adjustable camber or toe. You could adjust the shock position, but that's it. No adjustable camber, no adjustable toe, very limited adjustment on the car overall. Nowhere near the potential performance that a Sport would have. Never made a Pro. So back in the day when we were young, my friend group, we all had RC cars, at least some of us did. And we got into them quite heavily at one point. And I had a Tamiya TL01 and somebody else had a Kyosho, I think a Pure 10 Alpha. And then somebody got a Sprint, an HPI Sprint for their Christmas. And it was night and day. The Sprint had bearings throughout. Tamiya was definitely bushings. I don't know about the Kyosho. The Sprint had oil shocks. The Tamiya was definitely pogo sticks. Again, I'm not sure about the Kyosho. The Sprint had a way more efficient twin belt drivetrain system. It was so much more efficient than the shaft drive version in the Tamiya and the belt drive version in the Kyosho, in that it was just a more efficient design. Big, lovely big bearings in it. The belts ran looser. The Sprint had such a low center of gravity compared to the other two. Cornered flatter. Obviously the shocks helped with that. It was much lighter. It was just a better car. You could hear it was much quieter as it zipped around. It would just run circles. Eventually, several of us got Sprints, including myself. So I actually had an HPI Sprint myself. And my first racing experience was with a Sprint, even though it wasn't a race car. We entered a local club and we fitted adjustable links to the Sprint. We fitted ball bearing differentials because it had gear diffs. Not that the gear diffs are any better or worse than ball diffs. It's just that back in the day, gear diffs were slightly crude, slightly more rumbly. And the ball diffs was where if you want to get something really smooth, you got ball diffs. So we fitted longer drive shafts to fit the ball diffs because it wasn't quite compatible. I don't know if they were from a Pro 2 or Pro 3 or whatever they were. No, they weren't Pro 3. They might have been Pro 2 or something else. I don't know. 3 years later, in 2005, the Sprint 2 came out. And it was very similar looking to the Sprint, although it wasn't exactly the same chassis. And it had adjustable links, adjustable toe and camber, like what we did to our Sprint 1. I referred to it as the Sprint Custom. But yeah, it was essentially what became the Sprint 2. Although, like I say, the chassis wasn't quite the same. Incidentally, I also owned a Sprint GTI, which was a short wheelbase version of a Sprint 1 with a Citroen Saxo or Peugeot 106 body shell. I had a Saxo, and I ran it with no rear belt, no rear diff, no rear drive shafts, so it was only front wheel drive, but it actually worked really well. I tell you what, it would absolutely lace a Tamiya Mini. But anyway, the point is, I had that for a little while and it was cool. But this is the point where it gets confusing for the first time. You've had the Pros, we've had the Sports, we've had the Sprints. But Sprint 2 was kind of halfway between the bottom and in the middle tier. It was slightly above the entry level, but not quite the club level, because it had adjustable links. Now you might think, well, that's just because things move on. Fair enough. But the Sprint 2 could be used as a very basic club racer, a bit like a Sport, although not as good as a Sport, because it did have the adjustability. And I say not quite as good as a Sport, because in 2015, many years later, the Sport 3 came out. Now the Sport 3 is not in line with other sports. It is below. It is very much an entry level car because I like that. But incidentally, HPI, if you're watching, the Sport 3 Creator Edition, get in touch. I really want one, and I know exactly what I would do with it. The Sport 3 has no adjustability at all. Again, like the original Sprint, you could change the shock positions, but the links are fixed. You can pay for aftermarket, well not aftermarket, HPI make them themselves, but upgrade adjustable toe and camber links. But as standard, it doesn't come with those. I really like the shaft drive design, by the way, of the Sport 3 because it's fully sealed. It makes a good outdoor car. Anyway, so what you've done is you've got Sprint, and then you've moved up that Sprint, and then you've got Sport, and then moved down the third Sport. So now the Sport 3 is below the Sprint 2 in terms of adjustability. So the Sprint was the entry level series, but now it's slightly above the Sport. And what makes it more confusing is the Sprint 2 had several versions. You had the Sprint 2 Ready to Run, which is what it sounds like, brushed. Sprint 2 Flux, which was a brushless Ready to Run. Sprint 2 Drift, which was a Ready to Run with drift tyres. And then the Sprint 2 Sport. So was that a slightly more hopped up Sprint 2 to bring it in line with the Sport series? No, it was a Sprint 2 with a different brushed system than the original brushed Sprint 2. Okay. So, in conclusion, Pros were at the top, Sprints were at the bottom, and Sports were in the middle. By the end of it, Sprints had a Sport, the Sport was below the Sprint, and the Sprint was in the middle. But not quite in the middle, but slightly lower than the middle. And now, you have a Sprint 3, which should be the third in this sort of entry-level series, only it's called the Pro, and it's the highest end touring car HPI have ever made. Anyway, the Sprint 3 Pro was first spotted, the prototype, in December of 2024 in some World Championship competition in China. And then this year it was unveiled at a hobby show in Las Vegas properly. And there was a carbon fiber chassis version and a steel chassis version. So obviously 2 price points. But most of the parts are carbon fiber on both. It seemed like an odd thing for HPI to do, to try and, fly too close to the sun and burn their fingers again on high-end racing, because they're just recovering and becoming a major player again in the industry, having been bankrupt twice. And touring car racing is not as popular as it once was. But by all accounts, what's happened is they've used this Sprint 3 Pro as a test bed to develop the next Sprint 3, and just decided that since they created a prototype anyway, why not sell a select few Pros to people who want to do high-end racing and just look for something different, which is cool. I like that. But either way, it means that the Sprint moniker is now above the Sport moniker, which is a reverse of what it used to be, because even if this Pro is the super high-end version, and then the actual non-Pro, the Sprint mainstream mass-produced version, is less exotic with less adjustability, this car has all of the hallmarks of a high-end touring car, with the super, super low center of gravity, where the shocks are actually lower than the wheels themselves. Everything is so hunkered down, so squat. It has obviously full adjustability, including, and I love the way the caster is adjusted on it. The caster adjustment's fantastic. It has links that are connected to the front hubs, which bring the caster back and forth just depending on spanner adjustment, which is, to me, that's super high end. I haven't raced a touring car for many years. I love the way that modern touring cars look, by the way, because after I stopped, in the mid 2000s, and then by the time we got to the sort of end of the 2000s, high-end touring cars, I thought, personally, it's sort of plateaued, because there was no real major innovations. They were all twin belts, and they were playing around with, floating servos, and various things to try and pinpoint where flex needed to be. So you sometimes had adjustable flex, like the TC5, the associated TC5 had different top decks for you to play around with the flex, and it seemed very incremental changes. And I figured if I fired an old Lossy GRXS Type R on the track, it would be as quick as anything, because they were just fiddling with little details by that point. Now, if you look at, the GRXS Type R is the most exotic touring car that I own by a long way. If you compare that to a modern touring car, it looks like a Land Rover. It's all jacked up and tall, whereas a modern one's so sleek and low center of gravity. This Sprint 3 looks more like a modern X-Ray than an old Sprint, just the way it's so focused and racy. So even if the new version of the Sprint, the non-Pro, is not as high end as the Pro, it's still going to be way above the Sport 3 in terms of capability. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And it's a twin belt with the spur sit in the middle, so it'll be a rear mid-motored, so the motor slightly behind the spur. It just looks fabulous. So you might be asking yourself, well, why am I so obsessed with the Sprint 3 then? Because, Schumacher still make high-end touring cars, X-Ray make high-end touring cars, Yokohama make high-end touring cars, Associated have just come back into the high-end touring car game, and they're all super focused, super low center of gravity racing machines. Why is the Sprint 3 interesting to me when those aren't? Well, first of all, I have nostalgia for Sprints. We had Sprints, as I said, as kids. We ran around the Sprints. They were better than all the other entry-level stuff. I first raced with a Sprint. I've owned a Sprint GTI. My friend Scott has a Sprint. I've raced against him. There's something nostalgic about the HPI RS4 Sprint to me. Also, HPI have really brought themselves back into the game, especially recently, because they came back in and they were producing products that were really good, but they were overpriced. They were pricing them like they were still a high-end player when they were really not there yet, because the supply chains hadn't been fully developed yet. The spares weren't fully available. The trust in their products from the community wasn't there yet. So what they've done recently is smash out banger after banger model, it's very small range for really decent prices, and that's the key. They're really well priced, a lot of it. And if the Sprint 3 Pro is priced the way the HPI generally are, it's going to be expensive because it's a high-end touring car, but it probably, very likely, will undercut the other top-end stuff. And then the non-Pro, the Sprint 3, which I am imagining will be a bit like what the Sports used to be, the same basic design, but with less exotic material. So it could be that, for example, it isn't carbon fiber anywhere. It might be. We've not seen the non-Pro version yet. Or it could be that the non-Pro version is literally the carbon one with the steel chassis, because there is 2 versions. But I don't think that's the case. Either way, they'll undercut the likes of the X-Rays and stuff by price, because it's seen as more of an entry-level club car with all the capability you could ever need. It's really cool. So I like the idea, I really like the idea of a racing machine from HPI Racing, because they don't make any racing machines despite the name. And I've said several times that I wish they did, because then they can justify having themselves called HPI Racing. And without a race machine, you can't do that. I was surprised this is the way they've done it. I would have thought GT12 would be a more cost-effective way to get back into the racing scene, especially since it's more accessible and more popular. But hey, touring cars, love them. So I prefer touring cars to anything. So there you are. So yeah, genuinely excited to see what the non-Pro version is, or at least to get confirmation of whether or not that steel chassis one is the non-Pro. But I don't think so. So we've got to the situation now where once this is out, it's all switched. Pro still at the top, but now Sprint's above Sport. Unless they release an HPI Sprint 3 Sport. I don't know. Do whatever you want at HPI, we'll be watching it with intrigue. Genuinely excited, yeah. The only touring car that would possibly get me more excited than the next Sprint is if, and then this is never going to happen, if Team Lossy came back and said, we're building a successor, a true successor, a spiritual successor to the XXX with a new version of that single belt drivetrain that wraps all around, but with a belt that doesn't degrade. And it's, if you imagine a super low center of gravity, properly focused, high-end modern touring car with that single belt wraparound drivetrain, and it was made by Team Lossy, and it was like the XXS2 or something. That I don't care how much that would cost. I would have to get one. So that's the only car that would be more exciting to me than a new Sprint. But yeah, that looks really cool. Looking forward to hearing a bit more about it. And yeah, interested to hear your thoughts on the thing. You looking forward to it, or is it just yet another touring car to you? Let me know. Thanks for watching. Take care. And see you later. Bye bye.